Welcome to the fourth edition of the API Platform Conference. First thing, who in the room is a Symfony user? Okay, so if you have already tried API Platform, you are a Symfony user because currently, except if you are doing very weird things, that's possible, but that's weird. When you install API Platform, you install Symfony and you use Symfony, basically. So my name is Kevin Dinglas. I'm the creator of API Platform, and I'm also a core contributor of Symfony for years now. I work at Letiel, you know how to pronounce the thing now. And I mostly develop in PHP, but I also work a lot in C, in Go, and in JavaScript. So thank you very much for being at this API Platform conference. The API Platform community is still growing, and that's nice. Thank you very much to all the people that are there today, to all the speakers, of course, but also to the people that contribute to the code and the documentation, because the project starts to be huge, and it wouldn't be possible without all the many contributors and the people that are making the community alive during all the year. As you can hear, I'm from France. API Platform is from France, Symfony is from France, and both tools are very, very used in France and in Europe. But outside of Europe, the most popular PHP framework is Laravel. It's not Symfony. Actually, Laravel is also the most popular framework across all programming languages. It's more popular than Ruby on Rails, than Django, than most server-side JavaScript frameworks. So today, we will announce the major feature of API Platform 4, which is support for Laravel in addition to support for Symfony. So who already Thank you. You will see that it's very, very easy to use. Very easy. But it has been very, very hard to do, to be honest. Who has already tried Laravel in the room? Okay, many of you anyway. Okay, so you should know that there are a lot of ways to install Laravel. The recommended ways to use Composer, so you can type Composer, create project, Laravel, and you get a working Laravel project. But you can also use many installers. There is Laravel Herd that will and install all the dependencies, PHP, web server, etc., that you need on your computer and will allow you to create new projects. There is a Docker installer. There is an installer for Vagrant. There are many ways to install Laravel. So to use API Platform with Laravel, you need a Laravel installation. You can do that, or you can just open an existing Laravel project. All that I will show during this talk will work. Laravel is the most popular web framework. It has a very huge number of stars on GitHub. It has a lot of contributors, and in the Laravel contributors, you should include all the many Symfony contributors, because Laravel is using a lot of Symfony components. Basically, I think that many Symfony users are also Laravel users. So there are a lot of interactions and a lot of discussions between both communities. The project just raised a lot of money from a well-known VC. So we can bet that many people that are using JavaScript because it's hype will start using Laravel because it's even hyper. Okay, so another new feature that we are working on since for a while, but that is stable with API Platform 4, is that you can just cherry pick the parts of API Platform that you like. Now we have separate packagist repositories, separate packages that you can install to select the features that you need in your project. This works both for Symfony and Laravel. So in your Laravel project, you can just type composer require API platform Laravel, and you get a working API platform API in your Laravel project. Most of the code of the integration of API platform with Laravel, and actually most of the API platform code since version 2, has been written by Antoine Blucher. Antoine will go in depth in all the new features of API platform in the opening keynote of the afternoon. So don't miss Antoine's talk, and thank you very much to Antoine. All that I will show basically has been done by Antoine. So if you try and there are bugs, don't ask me, just just send a mail to Antoine or ask him to fix the bugs. Thank you, Antoine. Okay, Laravel has a development server called, it's using the built-in PHP web server, so it's just like the built-in web server in Symfony. You type PHP artisan serve and you have a development ready web server. And if you go on the /API path, you can see that API platform has been installed and is already up and running. It is already available. So on the API path, we register the root that will load Swagger UI. It's an open source tool to display OpenAPI documentations. OpenAPI is a standard to specify all the endpoints, the resources, the types, the relations exposed by your API, and the validation constraints, everything. So by default, your Laravel application will show Swagger UI, but will also, under the hood, generate an OpenAPI specification for your API that will be available at the /API/docs root. 0 line of code for now. But how is it possible? Because most people think that API platform is a Symfony-specific tool. It's a Symfony bundle. And that was true. The first version of API platform was a Symfony bundle and was usable only with Symfony. That's not the case anymore since API Platform 2, so it's quite old already. Since API Platform 2, we refactored the code to make the core of API Platform a standalone PHP library that can be used in any PHP project. The thing is that it was hard to do, but it was possible. And at Letiel, we had some prototypes, some internal projects that were using API Platform or parts of API Platform, because it's also possible, in projects that were not using Symfony at all. Now, there are two integrations with popular frameworks in API Platform. There is the Symfony bundle, as usual, but that is using this core library. And as of today, there is also a Laravel package. Both, we are not switching from Symfony to Laravel. Actually, we are adding a new variant to API Platform, and we will continue to support and innovate with the Symfony variant. We will try to make the Laravel variant a first-class citizen. And I hope that we will manage to support other ecosystems and other frameworks in addition to Symfony and Laravel. More about that in a few slides. So now we have two ecosystems that can leverage API Platform, and the goal is not to switch from one to another. We don't make a choice between Symfony and Laravel. The goal is to be able to create state-of-the-art web APIs in both ecosystems. And actually, both the Symfony bundle and the Laravel package will use the exact same code. Almost all the features of API Platform are available on the the two frameworks and are using the same code. There are some Symfony-specific features because we are using features that are only available in Symfony. And as you will see during this talk, there are also some Laravel-specific features because they are using features that are only available in Laravel. But that's a few part of the features. Most of the infrastructure is shared. And basically, when you are using API platform with Laravel or Symfony, it's executing the exact same code. And that's not all. It's also possible to use API platform without any framework. If you have a vanilla PHP project, we now have a documentation that you can find on the API platform website explaining how to install the library and bootstrap it in a project without any external dependencies. You just need API platform. And using it's not very useful, or at least you need to be really motivated to do that in your project. But this works. The main goal of this documentation is to nudge the community of other ecosystems to create integrations with API platform. Now we have support for Laravel and Symfony, but it should be quite easy to add support for Laminas or for Yi and for other frameworks like that, following this documentation and creating a module for the other frameworks. And that's something that we want to encourage. So let's come back to the new feature, the main new feature, because there are a lot of new features in API platform for the Laravel support. So what's inside this package, API platform / Laravel? It's a Laravel package, so it's basically a module, an extension for the Laravel framework. In this package, you have what we call a provider. A provider is just something that will register all the services provided by API platform in the dependency injection container of Laravel. So basically, in API platform, you have a lot of services that will do the serialization, that will process data, that will connect to different databases systems, that will generate documentations in following the OpenAPI specification, the Hydra documentation. All of them are basically objects that need to be initialized when the application boot, and it's what the Laravel provider does. Then there is an integration with the Laravel router. Automatically, the Laravel package will detect the resources that will be exposed through the API, and will plug into the Laravel router register the standard route, the standard REST routes, so the get, post, patch, and delete HTTP operations, and register a special controller provided by the package that will implement these routes. So basically, the API will work. We will see that in a few seconds. There are the support for the documentation, and so we added a lot of specific code to deal with the internals of Laravel and being able to automatically document the model classes that you will expose through the API using this format. There is support for GraphQL. GraphQL is one of the major features of API platform because with API platform, both with the Laravel and the Symfony variant, you can have a REST and a GraphQL API using the exact same code. And this also works with Laravel. And finally, we tried to make the API platform experience when using Laravel as natural, as idiomatic as possible. And in Laravel, there are a lot of specific features of the framework that Laravel users love, including the ORM of Laravel, Eloquent, validation, data validation, authorization support through gates and policies, a mode to make your application super fast using a tool called Octane, and many, many other tools like that that are specific to Laravel. We created integrations between API platform and these tools, so Laravel users can use the features of the framework that they love with API platform in a very native way. Okay. So in Laravel, there is a default ORM that most users use, and that is a component that is provided by Laravel called Eloquent. So Eloquent is an active record ORM. Basically, that means that you have a table. Your table have rows, and every row will have a corresponding PHP object that will be of extending the model class. And you can manipulate directly this object. There are methods to save, delete, update the object. So it's popular in many ecosystems like Ruby on Rails or Django in Python. It's a standard way to, it's the standard pattern for ORM. But it's not popular in the Symfony ecosystem because in Symfony we mostly use Doctrine that implements another ORM pattern called data mapper that is a bit different. In Laravel, to manipulate some data and store it in database, the only thing that you have to do, it's a native Laravel feature, it's to call the PHP artisan make model command and pass as parameter the name of the model. Artisan, the command line tool of Laravel, will generate this class with a single line of code. By convention, Eloquent will find a table named books, in lowercase with a final s, and will expose through this class all the columns of the table as magic properties. So you don't have to do anything. If you add a title column in the database, then you can access a title property to change the data or access the data. And Laravel will take care of everything else. It's quite convenient. It's not very explicit, but it's quite convenient. You will see in a few seconds that it was a huge problem for API platform. So the magic of Eloquent is that with a single class and without defining explicitly the properties that you want to define in your model, Eloquent will query the database, fetch all the columns, and make them accessible magically through the model class. One thing that is interesting with Eloquent is that while it's part of Laravel, it's also available as a standalone library. And it can even be used with Symfony because Wouter, a member of the Symfony core team, maintains a Symfony bundle allowing to use Eloquent with Symfony. And it's not ready yet, but very soon you will be able to use the Symfony variant of API platform using Eloquent instead of Doctrine or other popular ORM in the Symfony ecosystem. Anyway, let's come back to Eloquent. Eloquent has support for SQLite, Postgres, MySQL, MariaDB, and SQL Server. So basically, it means that if you have existing tables in one of these databases, you just create the class, one class for every table. You don't have to add the properties, and you can access to everything directly in your PHP code. It's quite convenient. There is no need to write the properties. There is no explicit mapping required. Everything is auto magic. So to manipulate some data with the book class that we have created, the only thing that we have to do is to create a SQLite database. It's what is used by default by Laravel, to add a books table and to add some columns, and that works. That's not, that works, that's easy. That's not very convenient because, for instance, if you share your work with a team, your team will have to share the database too. That will not very, very convenient. So the recommended way to create the databases in Laravel is to use migrations. So there is another artisan command allowing to generate a migration class. And in this class, you will define the tables and the columns to create. So in my example, I create a books table with an ISBN number. It's the identifier of books, a title, a description, an author, a publication date. When I run the migrate command, some SQL queries will be run, and the table and the columns will be created for me. And with that, I have a working model in my applications. That's very, very easy. Okay, so now let's talk a bit about API platform. When you are using Laravel, you run a single command to create a class of one line. You create, or you already have, some tables with some columns. You add one attribute, the API resource attribute. And that's all you need to have a state-of-the-art API with fully packed with features and implementing the most powerful API standards of the world. So with these 2 lines of code, a class extending the Eloquent model class and the API attribute, I get that. That means a fully documented API with an open API specification. It's a JSON document explaining, making available to the front-end developers documentation with all the URLs that are available, the JSON schemas describing the structure of the JSON data that will be returned by the API, all the types of the properties of the JSON properties in the documents, the relations, basically everything is documented. I get a UI written in React that is an open source project called Swagger UI that will display this machine-readable documentations for humans. I get all the standard REST routes automatically registered, implemented, and working. So, for instance, if I inject some data in the database or use the post route to add some data, then I can use the get route on API/books. The route has been created automatically. The data is fetched automatically. It is paginated automatically, and it is exposed, as you can see, using the JSON LD format, which is a W3C standard as HTML, CSS, etc., for state-of-the-art web APIs. 2 lines of code. So how does it work? Because in API platform, we need to generate a documentation for clients and for the serialization with all the properties documented. So API users can browse the documentation and see that there is a title, there is an author for this book. But it's hard to know that for API platform because in Laravel, everything is magic. You just have to create a column in the database, and at runtime, the ORM will just do something like select star, and then populate magic properties at runtime. When we generate the documentation, the database can be totally empty. So maybe there is 0 book in the table, and we still need to generate the documentation. Actually, to do that, we do a bit of magic. We are running an introspection query to the database. So basically, we run a query on the database to list the columns, the tables, and all the metadata of the tables themselves. And we use that to populate metadata, the API platform metadata. There are objects that basically describe the entire API. The name of the resources, all their properties, all their types. So basically, we run a SQL queries. We run a SQL query, and using the data coming from the database, we populate the API platform metadata. We'll say that this is slow, and indeed, this can be slow. But don't worry, everything is put in cache. So basically, it's done only one time. Then there is a PHP file that is generated containing all the data. So in production, it's pretty fast. Everything in API platform is using this metadata object for serialization, for generating the Open API and the Hydra documentation. Everything is built on top of this metadata object. And actually, this metadata object is not new. In the Symfony variant of API platform, we already use this metadata object, and basically we use the doctrine metadata, the Symfony serializer metadata, etc., to populate our object describing the entire API. We just reused the exact same object with Laravel. The code is entirely shared between the Laravel and the Symfony variant of API platform, even for this very low-level part of infrastructure. And if you are familiar with API platform, you know that you can use the API resource and the API property attributes to change the metadata, to change, let's say, the URL, the name of the property. You can change basically everything using these attributes. These attributes are supported both in Symfony and in Laravel. They are the exact same attributes. And as with the Symfony variant, everything is configurable and extensible. So you can hook everywhere, plug your custom logic as usual in API platform. If you don't want to use Eloquent, but you want to implement CQRS or some DDD-like directory structure and things like that, you can still do that as with the Symfony variant, just by implementing some classes and setting some properties of the API resource and API property attributes. API platform has the best standard support across all programming languages for API tools. By default, we expose a true REST API implementing the most advanced standards like JSON-LD, schema.org, Hydra, that makes your API very easy to use with client-side tools and with advanced tools. For instance, thanks to JSON-LD, you can, in a few lines of code, use your existing API platform APIs to train AI models. It's very easy. You can do that in a few lines of code because of this specification. It works, of course, with the Symfony variant. It's also the case with the Laravel variant. The exact same format, including many RFCs that are popular for APIs, are implemented out of the box. And it's the main strength of API platform, to be honest, because then you can consume the API with the programming languages that you want, with tools that are entirely automated, that can read the OpenAPI specification or read the RDF data and use them automatically without any line of code. Especially in Python, you have a lot of libraries to consume RDF APIs, and you can do magic things in a few lines of code. Another very interesting thing is that by default, without having to do anything, we respect and enforce all the security best practices of REST API promoted by OWASP. OWASP is an organization editing security standards, basically, and they are very hard to implement. If you create your API by hand, be sure to check the REST cheat sheet and be sure that your API are secure. It's not easy to do. Trust me on that. API platform enforces these policies by default, including, of course, with the Laravel variant. Okay, in addition to JSON-LD, in Laravel, as with the standard version of API platform in the Symfony variant, we support other formats for APIs. We support JSON API, which is a popular format, HAL, which is a less popular format but quite used. You can even get the data exposed by your API in CSV. I like this feature because when power user want to manipulate the data using Microsoft Excel or Google Spreadsheet, then you just have to add .csv at the end of any URL exposed by API platform, and they can open the data in a spreadsheet. So it's also supported by the Laravel variant. You just have to open the Laravel config, tweak the configuration to enable these formats, and all the formats will work at the same time if necessary. By default, only JSON-LD is enabled for security reasons, but it's just a single line of code to add CSV support, for instance. So GraphQL, with the 2 lines of code, the book extend model and the API resource attribute, you install the API platform / GraphQL package, you open the config and you set the enabled flag to true, and tadam, you get a fully featured GraphQL API in addition to the REST API. You get a UI called GraphQL to browse the documentation that has been automatically generated by API platform, and you can send all the GraphQL queries that you need. Pagination is supported, filters, sorting, etc. All the features that you can expect from modern web APIs are supported out of the box. There are some existing features for data serialization in Laravel. So we build on top of that in the new Laravel variant of API platform. To hide some fields, if there are some fields that you want to be available in PHP but not publicly through your API, you just have to add a hidden property and list the fields to hide in the array that's supported by API platform. There is another strategy. You can also say, OK, I just want to expose through the API this list of properties. To do that, I add a visible property, and I list the properties that must be included in the final response in the API. All other properties, all other columns in the database will be hidden. We have support for filters that are using Eloquent under the hood. So for instance, and Antoine will go in depth about the new filters in API Platform 4 during his keynote. You can add a query parameter. So there is a teeny difference with the Symfony variant. Because we don't have the list of properties explicitly, we cannot add the attribute directly on the property because it doesn't exist. So what you can do in API Platform 4, and it works with Symfony too, you can add the filter or query parameter. It's a new feature that Antoine will showcase during his keynote right on the class, and use the key property of the attribute to identify the properties that you want to filter. So here I say that I want to be able to do a partial search on the title property, on the title column, because there is a 1-1 mapping in Eloquent. And I just have to do that. Automatically, it's added to the documentations, the Hydra and the OpenAPI documentation. And this works. This is using Laravel under the hood, and this filters the data to do this search. There are a lot of filters that are already available for Eloquent. Text filters, date filters, Boolean logics, sorting the data, range, and even more advanced filters like the ability for the client to ask to generate only the properties that will be displayed. So for instance, I only display the title of the book. I can use a specific query parameter to fetch only the title and not the other properties. As usual in API platform, there are a lot of settings, a lot of features, and everything can be configured very easily. So you can go in the config/API platform.php. There is a typo in my, I'm too used to Symfony, but it's .php in Laravel, and you have the main configuration format. You can set properties on the API resource attribute, and you can use the typical operations. Quick example. With this more advanced example, I change the default number of items per page in the collection, and I only enable the read operation, so this API will be entirely read-only. I will only have the get operations, not the put, delete, etc. operations. And I can do a lot of things using configurations like that. Authentication. Laravel have many authentication way to authenticate users. There is nothing specific about that in API platform. Everything is supported. So you can use the standard form-based user system of Laravel or Laravel Sanctum that allows us to do authentication for SPAs and using API tokens, or Laravel Passports, which is a fully featured OAuth server, or Laravel Socialite, which allows to log the users using third-party systems like Google, GitHub, and things like that. That will work. Even third-party packages for other mode of authentication works out of the box. So there is nothing Symfony. Sorry, there is nothing API platform specific about that. Data validation, there is a system to validate requests, to validate the data using Laravel. It's supported out of the box by API platform. You run the make request command. In the rules function, in the rules method, you can add some constraints. For instance, here, my title is required, is unique, and has a max size. It will be automatically detected and enforced by API platform. You can also add some authorization rules. For instance, here I want only the admins to be able to create or update data. This will be automatically enforced thanks to the authorized method. Of course, as usual with API platform, the errors will be generated following a RFC describing a standard way to expose errors to the consumer of the API. So it's very easy to use, for instance, in JavaScript. And the status code is set to the proper error status code, etc. You can also create advanced authorization logic, for instance, to select who can access this data or not, depending on all the criteria that you want. Again, there is a native system for that in Laravel called policies. You have a command to generate a default policy. You implement these authorization rules, and it will be used automatically by API platform. Again, very Laravel native. The main topic of my last talk during API platform conference was FrankenPHP, a new PHP application server that allows to improve a lot the performance of PHP application. It's by default in API platform for Symfony since 1 year, but at the same time, this has been implemented in Laravel by the Laravel core team in a package called Octane. API platform for Laravel is entirely compatible with Laravel Octane. So with these 3 commands, you execute your Laravel application with FrankenPHP in worker mode with very, very fast performance. The API that is exposed is standard. It follows the JSON-LD, Hydra, and OpenAPI specifications. So all the JavaScript tools that understand these specifications, including our own JavaScript tools in the API platform framework, work both with Laravel and API platform. So you can generate Next.js, Nuxt.js, Angular, Quasar application and use the admin. François Zaninotto will do a talk about the API platform admin during the conference. Don't miss it. This already works with Laravel. And soon we will have support for real-time. There is a mechanism in Laravel to push data. The server can push data to the clients when the data changes in database. So one user changes something, all the users get the data pushed to the browser in real time. It's called broadcast for the server part and echo for the JavaScript part. We are integrating Mercure into that. It's almost ready. Maybe in 1 month it will be ready. And this will work out of the box when using API platform with Laravel. Of course, I am, Antoine too, mostly Symfony users. And so we are not very, very familiar with Laravel. So what we have done is that we discussed with the Laravel core team about the project since a long time already. And they tried the project. And we were not sure about attributes because attributes are not very popular in the Laravel ecosystem. But Laravel news, they are using more and more attributes. And here is what the Taylor Otwell and the Laravel team say about this project because they tried it before you. We were discussing with them. So Taylor said, "We're so excited that API platform now supports Laravel. It's never been easier to create best practice API using Laravel when paired with API platform. So we are very happy to hear that, especially because there is a tiny system to create APIs in Laravel, but that have very few features compared to API platform. So we hope that that Laravel users will discover state-of-the-art API and all the power that you can unleash when using API platform to create APIs. Everything that I showcased and many more advanced features are already documented and available online. Antoine, again, and Laurie Sorio. Laurie is the front-end developer and designer that creates the API platform website and all the graphic designs. So a huge round of applause for Laurie because it's amazing. They did a huge work creating a brand new homepage for API Platform 4. And the website is available online right now. On this website, you can find two new things. First thing, API Platform 4 has been released and is available immediately. And as part of API Platform 4, there is the Laravel integration that is also available immediately with a brand new dedicated documentation with many more things covered in the documentation. Thank you very much.